The waitress had exactly $10 left in her wallet, and she already knew what those $10 were supposed to buy. A loaf of bread. A carton of milk. Maybe something cheap enough to stretch across 2 days if she was careful. She had counted the money 3 times that morning, placing each wrinkled bill on the tiny kitchen table of her rented apartment before sliding it carefully back into her wallet. But at 8:17 that evening, a freezing little boy walked into the restaurant without a coat, his mother standing behind him with trembling hands, and something inside the waitress changed. She looked at the $10. Then she looked at the child. And without knowing that someone powerful was watching, she gave away every cent she had. Less than 1 hour later, the door of that struggling little restaurant opened again. A black luxury car stopped outside. A billionaire stepped through the doorway. And what he said next would change the waitress's life forever. Before we continue, if you believe kindness still matters, if you believe people deserve second chances, and if you believe one small act can change an entire life, please like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to Kindness Speaks. Your support helps us bring more stories of compassion, courage, and second chances to people around the world. Her name was Emily Carter, and at 29 years old, she had become very good at pretending everything was fine. Every morning, she tied her dark brown hair into a simple ponytail, put on the same faded blue waitress uniform, slipped her worn sneakers onto her feet, and walked 6 blocks to the little restaurant where she had worked for nearly 7 years. The restaurant was called Maple Street Kitchen, a narrow family-owned place squeezed between a laundromat and an old bookstore in a neighborhood that had once been busy but had slowly fallen into decline. Its windows were slightly scratched, its wooden tables carried years of tiny marks, and one of the ceiling lights flickered whenever the weather became cold. But Emily loved the place. She loved the smell of coffee in the morning, the sound of plates being stacked behind the counter, and the familiar faces of customers who had been coming there for years. Most of all, she loved knowing that behind every table was a story. Emily's own story was one she rarely told. 5 years earlier, her father had died after a long illness, leaving behind hospital bills and a small house that eventually had to be sold. Her mother had passed away before that, so Emily had no family to fall back on. Her younger brother, Daniel, had left town after losing his job and had slowly disappeared from her life. Emily had spent years trying to keep herself standing while quietly carrying grief that never completely left her. She worked 6 days a week, sometimes 7, taking extra shifts whenever another waitress called in sick. She rented a small apartment above a hardware store, lived with an old refrigerator that made strange noises at night, and kept a jar beside her bed where she saved coins for emergencies. She wasn't poor because she was careless. She was poor because life had repeatedly taken more from her than she could replace. That particular Friday had been worse than usual. The restaurant had been almost empty all afternoon. A storm was expected overnight, and most people had stayed home. The owner, Mr. Harris, had spent much of the day staring at the cash register with a worried expression. The restaurant was already behind on rent, and the landlord had warned him that if another payment was missed, Maple Street Kitchen would have to close. Emily knew what that would mean. It would mean another job search, another round of rejection, another uncertain month. She had quietly promised herself that she would do whatever she could to keep the restaurant alive, even though she knew she couldn't afford to lose her own job. At the end of her shift, Emily checked her wallet. $10. That was everything. Her paycheck was still 4 days away, and she had already spent most of what remained from the previous one on rent and electricity. She stood behind the counter while Mr. Harris counted the day's earnings. There wasn't much. Emily watched him quietly, noticing how his shoulders seemed heavier than they had a few months earlier. He had built the restaurant after his wife died, naming it Maple Street Kitchen because maple trees surrounded the street where they had first met. He had always told Emily that the restaurant wasn't really about food. It was about giving people a place where they could feel less alone. That evening, just before closing, the front door opened. Emily looked up and saw a woman standing outside beneath the rain. She was perhaps 35, soaked from the weather, holding the hand of a little boy who couldn't have been more than 7. The boy was shivering. His clothes were thin, his hair was wet, and his cheeks were red from the cold. The woman hesitated at the doorway as though she wasn't sure they were allowed inside. Emily immediately walked toward them and smiled. She didn't ask why they were there. She didn't ask whether they could pay. She simply led them to a table near the heater and brought the boy a cup of warm water. The mother kept apologizing. She explained that she had been walking with her son for nearly an hour after missing the last bus. Her wallet had been stolen earlier that day, along with the little money she had. She had been trying to find somewhere warm until morning. The boy hadn't eaten since breakfast. Emily looked toward the kitchen. There was enough food left for one meal, maybe 2 if she stretched it. She quietly asked Mr. Harris if she could prepare something. He nodded without hesitation. Emily brought the boy a bowl of chicken soup, bread, and a small slice of apple pie. The child stared at the food as though someone had placed treasure in front of him. His mother covered her face and began to cry. Emily sat across from them for a moment. She could have walked away. She could have reminded herself that she had problems too. She could have said that she couldn't afford to help anyone tonight. Instead, she reached into her wallet. The $10 bill felt strangely heavy between her fingers. She placed it beside the woman's hand and told her to take it. The woman shook her head immediately, but Emily gently pushed it closer. She explained that she had a little food at home and would be fine. It wasn't completely true. She knew exactly what she would eat that night. Nothing. But she couldn't bring herself to take the money back. The woman finally accepted it, tears running down her face. She promised she would repay Emily someday. Emily smiled and told her that someday, when she had the chance, she should simply help someone else. The little boy looked at Emily and gave her a tiny smile. That smile was worth more than $10. Emily didn't know that someone had been watching the entire exchange. Across the street, inside a black sedan parked beneath the rain, a man sat quietly in the back seat. His name was Alexander Reed, a 46-year-old billionaire whose name appeared regularly in business magazines. He owned hotels, technology companies, luxury properties, and a chain of restaurants across the country. He had built his fortune through years of relentless work, but success had made him increasingly suspicious of people's motives. He had learned to question every favor, every handshake, every smile. People rarely did something for him without expecting something in return. That night, however, he wasn't supposed to be watching Emily. He had been driving through the neighborhood because he was considering purchasing several properties nearby. One of his companies was planning a major redevelopment project, and Maple Street Kitchen was located on one of the most valuable pieces of land in the area. His lawyers had already contacted the owner. He had been told that the restaurant was struggling badly and might soon be forced to sell. Alexander had planned to make an offer. But then he saw Emily give away her last $10. He watched as she returned to work without expecting applause. He watched her wipe the table, carry dishes into the kitchen, and smile at the little boy as though nothing extraordinary had happened. He watched the woman and her son leave through the front door, walking into the rain with the $10 bill safely tucked inside the woman's hand. Alexander stared at the restaurant for several seconds. Then he asked his driver how much cash he had. The driver looked confused but handed him a few bills. Alexander shook his head. He wasn't asking about money anymore. He was thinking about something much harder to buy. Trust. 1 hour later, the restaurant was almost empty. Mr. Harris was preparing to close when a black luxury car stopped outside. Emily was wiping down the counter when the front door opened. Alexander Reed stepped inside. Mr. Harris recognized him immediately. His face went pale. For months, he had been hearing rumors that a wealthy developer wanted to purchase the entire block. He had never imagined the billionaire himself would walk into his restaurant. Alexander calmly introduced himself and asked to speak with the owner. Mr. Harris told him he was the owner. Alexander looked around the restaurant, then looked at Emily. She didn't recognize him. He asked Mr. Harris how much he wanted for Maple Street Kitchen. Mr. Harris thought he had misunderstood. Alexander repeated the question. The amount he offered was far beyond anything Mr. Harris had ever imagined receiving for the restaurant. Emily stood frozen behind the counter. But Mr. Harris didn't accept immediately. He asked why Alexander wanted the restaurant. Alexander looked toward Emily. He explained that he had been sitting across the street and had witnessed what she had done. The room became completely silent. Emily's face turned red. She didn't know what to say. Alexander told Mr. Harris that he had spent years buying companies, buildings, and restaurants. He had purchased businesses with hundreds of employees and invested millions of dollars into projects that experts called brilliant. But he had rarely seen something as valuable as what he had witnessed that evening. He wasn't interested in buying the restaurant because of the building. He wanted to buy it because of what it represented. A place where kindness still mattered. Mr. Harris asked what Alexander planned to do with it. Alexander surprised everyone by saying he didn't want to replace the staff. He didn't want to turn the restaurant into another expensive corporate chain. He wanted Maple Street Kitchen to remain exactly what it was, only stronger. He wanted the employees to receive better wages. He wanted the kitchen repaired. He wanted the restaurant's debts cleared. He wanted meals available for people who couldn't afford them. And most importantly, he wanted Emily to become the person who helped run the place. Emily thought he was joking. She told him she was just a waitress. Alexander looked at her and said that was precisely why he wanted her. She understood people. She noticed when someone was lonely. She knew when a customer needed food more than a bill. She understood that a restaurant could serve more than meals. It could serve dignity. But Alexander wasn't finished. He explained that he wasn't simply offering Emily a promotion. He was offering her ownership. A percentage of the restaurant. Emily stared at him in disbelief. She asked why he would give something so valuable to someone he had met only once. Alexander told her that he hadn't met her once. He had watched her make a decision when nobody was rewarding her for it. That was the kind of character money couldn't manufacture. Emily began to cry. For years, she had felt invisible. She had worked while people looked through her. She had cleaned tables while customers complained about tiny things. She had gone home exhausted without anyone asking whether she was okay. She had learned to survive quietly. Now, for the first time, someone had seen her. Not her uniform. Not her financial struggles. Not her job. Her heart. The next morning, Alexander kept his promise. The restaurant's debts were paid. The broken equipment was replaced. The leaking ceiling was repaired. The kitchen received new appliances. The employees received raises. And a small sign was placed beside the entrance that read, "No one leaves hungry." Emily initially thought the changes were too much. She worried that the restaurant would lose what made it special. But Alexander told her that money should never erase kindness. It should give kindness more room to grow. Within months, Maple Street Kitchen became known throughout the city. People came for the food, but they stayed because of the atmosphere. There was a table where elderly customers could sit without being rushed. There were free meals for struggling families. Local students could work part-time and receive scholarships. Every Friday, the restaurant prepared extra meals for anyone who needed them. Emily became the heart of it all. She still wore a simple uniform. She still walked into the kitchen and checked every table. She still remembered the names of regular customers. But she no longer lived in fear of her next paycheck. She had her own small office upstairs. She had health insurance. She had savings. And she had something she had never expected to have again. Hope. Months later, on a cold winter evening, Emily was standing near the front window when she saw a familiar face. It was the little boy. He was wearing a warm red coat this time. Beside him stood his mother. Emily immediately recognized them. The boy ran inside. His mother hugged Emily tightly. She told her that the $10 had changed their lives. That night, they had found temporary shelter. The next day, she had used the remaining money to buy food and transportation to a community center where she eventually found work. She had come back because she wanted Emily to know that she had kept her promise. She had helped someone else. Then she handed Emily a small envelope. Inside was $10. Not the same $10 bill. But $10 nonetheless. The woman smiled through tears and told Emily that she had started keeping $10 aside every month. Whenever she saw someone struggling, she gave it away. Emily held the envelope against her heart. She understood then that the greatest part of kindness was not what happened in the moment. It was what happened afterward. One act could become another. And another. And another. Until something small became something much bigger than the person who started it. Alexander watched from across the restaurant. He smiled quietly. He had purchased the building. He had invested money. He had changed the business. But Emily had changed something in him. She had reminded him that wealth was not measured by how much a person could keep. Sometimes it was measured by how much good they could help create. Years later, Maple Street Kitchen was still standing on that same street. The old wooden tables remained. The familiar smell of coffee still filled the air every morning. The scratched windows had been replaced, but Emily insisted that one old wooden table stay exactly where it had always been. It became known as the kindness table. Anyone could sit there. Anyone could leave a meal for someone else. Anyone could pay $10 forward. And above that table was a simple handwritten message Emily had framed behind glass. It said, "You never know how far one small kindness will travel." Emily often thought about that rainy Friday night. She thought about the $10. She thought about the little boy's smile. She thought about the billionaire sitting across the street. And she realized something that she wished she had understood years earlier. She had believed she was giving away her last $10. In reality, she had given away the beginning of a completely different life. If this story touched your heart, please don't just watch silently. Like the video, share it with someone who believes in kindness, and subscribe to Kindness Speaks so we can continue bringing you stories that remind us that goodness still exists. Sometimes we don't realize how powerful a small act can be until years later, when we finally see where it led. And before we end, we have one special request for you. Comment, "Kindness always comes back," below if you believe that helping someone when you have little to give is one of the greatest forms of courage. Your comment may remind another person that kindness is never wasted. Because sometimes the person you help today won't be able to repay you tomorrow. Sometimes they won't even remember your name. And sometimes, without you ever knowing it, the small kindness you offered in your hardest moment becomes the reason someone else survives theirs. Emily gave away her last $10. She thought she was losing what little she had. But 1 hour later, a billionaire walked through the door. And what he bought wasn't just a restaurant. He bought a chance to prove that kindness could become a legacy. The restaurant grew. The people grew. The kindness grew. And Emily finally understood the truth that had been waiting for her all along. You don't have to be rich to change someone's life. Sometimes, all you need is $10, a generous heart, and the courage to give when you can barely afford to keep anything for yourself.